most recent report we got from the Inspector in General for Afghan Reconstruction. I think his name is John Sopko.
Yeah.
And for, well, I think actually over a decade now, God, I can't believe how long this war has been going on. Sopko has been
Yeah.
running this department where he puts out, I think, quarterly reports, occasionally testifies in front of Congress, and has given over time different metrics for what's happening in the Afghan war. Sometimes, for years we used to get reports here, Will, about how much territory the Taliban controlled versus the Afghan government or the U.S. Now that's no longer included, but there are still some really important facts and figures in this report. And then Sopko himself, I think, gave some pretty important and interesting testimony. So, Will, what
Yeah.
are the highlights of this?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned Sopko. He is, he's been pretty consistently one of the only officials that are really critical or remotely good on the Afghan war. And I think this new quarterly report that came out last week kind of keeps with that trend. It does not paint that good of a picture. It really also doesn't tell us much that we didn't know already, sort of in broad strokes. But there are some like specific stats and figures in there that we can get into. And like I said, it does not look very good. After 20 years of fighting, trillions of dollars that we've blown trying to prop up the government and the military over there, thousands of people killed on all sides, and it seems like we pretty much have nothing to show for it. And this report kind of highlights some of that. Especially as it's issued just as the Pentagon is saying. I think the last they said was that they're more than 90% out of the country. So the withdrawals is apparently going forward, according to them. But you had mentioned that they sort of stopped giving really specific breakdowns of like what territory the Taliban controls versus the government. This report does include some of that information partially. And basically, right now, the Taliban is grabbing up a whole lot of territory. They've kind of parlayed their usual spring offensive. Usually, when the spring comes around, they call that fighting season, and that's when sort of it picks up again. But they've kind of parlayed that spring offensive into a larger summer offensive, it seems. Because just between June and July, they went from controlling 81 districts in Afghanistan to more than 200. That's about half of the country. I think there are 419 districts in Afghanistan. They are leaving the provincial capitals alone. They're basically taking over the countryside. I think that they don't control. I don't know if they control any of the provincial capitals right now. Certainly not Kabul. This is not.
Well, they did
Oh, go ahead.
attack the capital of Helmand, Lashkargah, last week. I'm not sure what the status of that offensive is now, but apparently they were like in the outer districts of that. And when I talked to Danny last week, he explained that Kandahar is, I think he said, is a very large city, and they were in the outer districts of that city too. But for people who have maybe lived in one of America's real big cities, like around Chicago or something like that, you could be in Wisconsin and kind of be in a suburb of Chicago. So they could be pretty far away from the city, but in some sense, I guess they are, especially in the very heavily postured areas, at least starting to toy with the idea of these capitals.
Right, right. And I mean, it's like not too uncommon for them to kind of leave the major cities alone. Sometimes they will go in there and take it for a couple days. A lot of time it's sort of a gesture just to show like, look what we can do. But that is interesting. Like the report had said that they don't currently hold any of those, but like the things you're talking about are very recent. So perhaps they are now starting to push into some of those provincial capitals. However, earlier on in the spring, when they sort of started launching this offensive between March and May, there were more than 10,000 Taliban attacks, which is sort of an uptick compared to the same period in the previous years. I think last year it had 1,000 attacks fewer than the same period of the spring in 2021. And they've mostly been, almost exclusively been focusing these attacks on local Afghan forces. At least the report says. I think they've not really hit on U.S. or coalition troops too much since the deal was signed with Trump in 2020. Um, so apparently, there is a spike in attacks, though it's almost exclusively being directed against local forces. And over the summer, these attacks have sort of picked up in intensity and violence to the point that the period between May and June is a sort of a record number of civilian casualties. Like just over those couple months, I think 800 civilians were killed and 1,600 injured. And the UN is saying that this could make 2021 overall one of the deadliest years since they started counting this stuff in 2009. I think there had been some more violent years prior to that, but since they at least started keeping track of this, they're saying 2021 could be one of the more deadly years. So there's definitely been a spike in violence and deaths with all these recent attacks. And it does seem the Afghan military and sort of security forces can't stop it. The report even kind of describes them as being surprised and caught off guard by some of these attacks, which is a little strange given that sort of everyone's been predicting a Taliban offensive once the U.S. starts packing up and leaving. And it did sort of coincide with the spring offensive as well. So it's a little odd that they're so taken off guard by this.
And hasn't the
Um,
Afghan government itself warned about like a Taliban takeover if the U.S. should leave? So, I mean, it seems like that that's just has to be a poor excuse coming out of the Afghan government. There's no possible way they didn't see this coming.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit odd that they would be like so surprised by this. This is something that not only we've been warning about, but they've been, or at least talking about this possibility for a long time. But let's see. Poppy cultivation. There's a bit on this in the new SIGAR report. It's on a major rise in Afghanistan. People might recall Trump had that big drug war mission out there while he was in office, Operation Iron Tempest, where U.S. warplanes were bombing heroin labs and other kind of like drug production sites, and that ended up killing a lot of civilians. I think we covered that on the show a little bit, but it apparently had no lasting effect whatsoever because in 2020, poppy cultivation was up 37% compared to the previous year. And the highest concentrations of that were in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, which are both like heavily, controlled by the Taliban. And the Taliban itself doesn't always, they're not the ones actually growing and growing the poppies or harvesting the opium or producing the heroin, but these things can be sort of taxed at various stages of production when they're done in their areas. And so this ends up being very lucrative for them, ends up helping to sort of bankroll their operations, which I know we've covered that in a big long write up I think back in 2018. But I think basically right now we may be seeing the fruits of last year's like larger poppy crop that is sort of bankrolling this big offensive. Um, but in terms of sort of like the security situation that's mentioned in the report, that's about all I had. As pretty much anyone could have predicted, as we've been saying all along, the U.S. withdrawal will not necessarily be a nice walk in the park. I think it's sort of inevitable there's going to be violence as things kind of shift back to a more natural balance of power, as opposed to right now the U.S. is kind of propping up this like house of cards, this like power bubble that can't really exist in its current form on its own. So this report I think kind of illustrates all that. And you had mentioned this earlier. The guy who behind these reports, John Sopko, he was even more harsh and critical about all this when he was briefing the media about this last week. There was one line, and I'll read the quote, but there's one line where he's basically just saying that like the U.S. is pretty much guaranteed to repeat these failures of the Afghan war. He said, quote, don't believe what you're told by the generals or the ambassadors or people in the administration saying we're never going to do this again. That's exactly what we said after Vietnam. We're never going to do this again. Lo and behold, we did Iraq and we did Afghanistan. We will do this again, end quote. And I'm not sure if I could have summed it up much better than that. Like even as we finally seem to be headed out of this war, and even that part isn't totally certain given all this talk about over the horizon capabilities and stationing troops in neighboring countries and all this stuff. But even assuming we're definitely leaving, if nobody's learned any of these lessons here, we are doomed to repeat this stuff over again. Like even if the average American in flyover country, even if they're fed up with this and they understand that this was a disaster, it does not look like these lessons have sunk in for the government or for the foreign policy establishment or the media, and they are the ones often who get us into these things. It's not the average person. So unfortunately, I think Sopko might be right about this assessment that we are sort of doomed to repeat these things.
Right. And I feel like the scary part is right now, Will, is we may be doomed to repeat it in Afghanistan. As long as there's 650 troops at our embassy in Kabul, I mean, that essentially turns it into a military base. And when you have something that's essentially a military base, Danny Sturgeon's on a great podcast recently. I forget what it's called, but he basically explains that one of the ways the U.S. mission creeped worked in Vietnam is they started to deploy troops to like some diplomatic mission, but then those troops start having to go on little maneuvers outside the base to, deter rocket fire. Well, then they started getting attacked on those missions, and so they had to control a little bit more territory to make sure they weren't attacked. And it seems very possible that something like this happens in Afghanistan, especially after we have seen a change somewhat in the U.S. mission, not mission, I guess, in Afghanistan, but the way we're conducting our operations there in the past week or so, with a vast uptick in airstrikes and directly targeting the Taliban, which I isn't this a violation of the Doha Accords, Will? Didn't that say that the U.S. wasn't going to directly attack the Taliban? Now, I know the U.S. has done this throughout the whole time, since the Doha Accords have been signed. We've attacked the Taliban several times, even after Trump, and they seem to tolerate it to some extent. Still, there hasn't been an attack on a U.S. soldier fatality in the country, but how long will they tolerate that for before they start taking shots at the U.S., diplomatic diplomats or soldiers that are in that country? And then how does the U.S. react from there? I guess it seems a real question going forward. Will, do you have anything else on Afghanistan?
No, that was basically the highlights I think out of that new cigar report. There was other stuff in there about like the financial audits that people might find interesting, but I paid more attention to the more security situation in my write up about it.
Yeah.